This technology is amazing when it works. All right. My guest is Mikołaj Stanisław Kunicki. He is the author of Between the Brown and the Red, Nationalism, Catholicism, and Communism in 20th-Century Poland, the Politics of Boleslaw Piasecki, and he is a professor at Oxford University, senior research fellow in modern Polish studies and director of the program on modern Poland at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Thank you for joining me, Mikołaj.
Sure. If I may just correct pronunciation a little bit.
Thank you, sir. Go right ahead.
It's first name will be Mikołaj, and or you can simply call me Miko, and the last name is Kunicki.
Kunicki.
Kunicki. And as far as Piasecki is concerned, it's Piasecki, not Piasecki. It's CKI pronunciation. Piasecki, yeah.
Yeah, my own Polish Jewish roots I'll go way back, so I don't have any acculturation in terms of Polish society at this point. My family is completely Americanized several generations ago, so thank you for pointing that out.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things right off the bat that strikes me in your biography is that, and this I also picked up from another author I interviewed, in that in 20th century Europe generally, Poland probably more so, there was a lot of people who were involved in ideology and in thinking who shifted from left to right back to left, or right to left back to right, and or far left to far right to far left. And, we could take a look at that phenomena occurring in most European societies. How do you explain that? And basically, what are the contrasting differences between the two ideologies?
It's a very good point. And as you know, there is a fluid border sometimes between the left and the right, especially when we are talking about the extreme versions of both currents. I would say that it's good actually to look at commonalities in first place, because there are plenty of commonalities, particularly when you look at the 1920s, 1930s, or even the period of well, maybe not World War II, because this is really a benchmark actually, but yeah, let's talk about 1930s. First of all, this is the opposition basically to democratic political systems. Both the people who are on the extreme right and the people who are on the extreme left share this feature. There is no doubt about this.
Mm-hmm.
And that expands beyond politics, because if we are talking about the question of the economy, the ownership of the economy, these movements actually coming from the fascist movements and let's say the communist movement would share actually plenty of features. They were both thinking about having centralized economy, centrally managed, not to mention basically these political features which usually come to mind, that is essentially one party dictatorship. In the case of the fascists, as you probably know, they actually hated or disliked the very term party. They would always like to present themselves as the movement. And in this respect, I mean, this is another similarity, basically. You've got the movements which were aiming, at completely demolishing, the political scene, whether that was liberal democracy or just like in the case of Poland, pure Poland, or the majority of Central Eastern European countries, conservative authoritarians. In the case of the enemies, these two movements were projecting, that was pretty much the same gallery. They were very much opposed, not only to democratic, liberal, social democratic politicians, but also they were also hostile toward, conservative elites. Both were in a way revolutionary.
Right. I mean, I see both as you say, revolutionary, as messianic movements, as authoritarian and even collectivist movements,
Yeah.
kind of disincentivizing the what we view in America as the rise of the individual and private ownership and all of the things that make American culture and Western, I suppose, Western European culture what it was, and a move toward this kind of authoritarian model. But I think that with regard to your biography and with regard to a lot of the people who were on the right in Poland and particularly in Eastern Europe and in Germany, which eventually morphed into Nazism, a lot of this was a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, that's from my perspective, that it was the first truly leftist takeover of an entire society that was able to sustain itself. It exported its revolution into Germany. It invaded Poland, the new country. It took over Hungary for a brief period of time under Bela Kun. It basically was a worldwide movement to create the international dictatorship of the proletarians, and I think that the fascist movement was captured a reaction and a legitimate reaction to this movement, because let's not forget the Bolsheviks were the world's most brutal, most authoritarian, most despised regime in certainly in modern history, probably in all of history, and that Europe and Europeans wanted to counter it, and they wanted to protect what they viewed as freedom. So I think a lot of them migrated into fascism, which was also a communistic movement, but which was it at least embraced the trappings of Catholicism and of Westernism enough to the degree that people could embrace it. And I think that might describe your biography. Is that an accurate description?
It's a bit more complex. I mean, first of all, you have to remember that Stalin essentially abandons, the goal of worldwide revolution, or at least postpones the goal of worldwide revolution, in the late 1920s after consolidating his power. I mean, when you look at the Bolshevik establishment, it's Trotsky really, who is the embodiment, of this international messianistic, crusade. Whereas Stalin is really, someone who wants to build his own, state apparatus, essentially, which to some extent explains, the great purges of the 1930s. In order to build your own, cadres, you have to basically eradicate the old ones, right? In the case of fascism or fascisms, um, and I prefer actually the second term, there is no such a thing as generic fascism in a way. Because fascism always actually takes into its national DNA national specificities. That really explains the fact, for example, that in the case of NSDAP and Nazism, that has to do basically with the pan-German, folkish roots, sometimes even some neo-paganic, things, rather than basically religious ideology. Whereas in the case of Poland, or in the case of Romania, the Iron Guard and Codranu, his movement, religion actually played quite substantial role, which has to do with, to some extent, with the religious militancy that takes place in the 1920s, and it takes place in the case of Catholicism. You've got Catholic action taking place in Europe all over in the 1920s. So it's more nuanced. Plus, what you should definitely keep in mind is that in terms of the roots of fascism, and I think the Italian example actually exemplifies this thing very well. It very often actually starts in the form we know as the movement of military veterans, World War I veterans. Italy is a classic example of this. In the case of Germany, you also have the spirit, of
The Freikorps.
Yeah, the Freikorps, exactly, and the brotherhood born in trenches. So in this respect, I think World War I is definitely indispensable. Of course, you've got which you mentioned, basically, what takes place, in Germany in 1918, the aborted revolution, then, rather feeble, attempts, minus the Polish Bolshevik War and minus the Hungarian Republic of Councils. Because, honestly, by 1922, when Mussolini basically gets power, which is presented to him by the king and the conservative elites, there is really no such a thing, as the communist threat in the case of Italy. So it's the mixture basically of these hotheads, authoritarian strongmen, still people in their 30s usually with a military experience, and they thirst for quick solutions, and also brutality, which again comes, from being completely isolated, in the trenches of World War One, and then the fear of the conservative elites. And I think Italy is a very good example in this respect. I mean, in Poland we have, the military coup d'état of Piłsudski in 1926. Right. But this is just, this is a sort of military coup d'état led by the officers who are not fascists, who very often, Piłsudski himself basically, are former socialists. Sure. So, you've got this whole movement basically going on.
Well, I think that Poland is very unique in somewhat of a hybrid case, in that you seem to have both right and left leaning, such as Piłsudski, movements that embrace a more totalitarian system. They also embrace Catholicism. They embrace anti-Semitism, which I think emanated from the Catholic Church. And they have a lot in common on both sides in their opposition to Bolshevism and their insistence on Polish nationalism. And it seems like a very unique development that emanated out of the situation that Poland found itself in, particularly after attaining independence in 1917.
It really goes back. It really goes back to the competition between two branches of the independence movement prior to 1914, 1918. You've got the anti-Semitic and nationalistic, ethnically, although striving for ethnically defined, identity, nationalist movement of Roman Dmowski. Whereas Piłsudski is someone else. Piłsudski is really coming, Piłsudski is coming from the left-wing political thought. He was a socialist. Yeah. Unlike Dmowski and the people from the National Democratic Movement, he was definitely not anti-Semitic. But you are right. In 1935, Piłsudski dies, and after that, the Sanacja regime, the people who essentially inherited his system, are becoming nastier and nastier. They start actually flirting, with such fascists like Piasecki in Poland, and you've got similar phenomena taking place actually in East Central Europe at that time. And yes, some of the Sanacja colonels, are basically endorsing, anti-Semitism. So this regime is getting nastier and nastier.
And also, I found it interesting in what I've read so far in your book, and I'm continuing. It's an excellent book and very, very beautifully written too, I may add.
Thank you.
That Poland, in the very beginning of its independence, in a way echoed a little bit of the German style of ethnic nationalism, in that the Polish movement generally saw itself as expanding into areas such as Pomerania and Silesia, East Prussia, as being sort of historic Polish lands, and that ultimately Poland would find itself in a political and military position where it could assume control of those areas. So in a way, it's very similar to the German movement, to the German Volk movement, the idea that Polish nationals and Polish ethnics must ultimately find, and by the way, the same thing was true in Hungary, with the reassertion of control over parts of Transylvania and parts of Yugoslavia, that this was part of an overall European, an element of an overall European nationalist movement that eventually found its ultimate manifestation in the Nazi takeover of Eastern Europe.
Jochen Bohlen, my German friend, who is at the Schiller University in Jena, wrote actually a pretty good book recently, which deals with the struggle for the shape of Polish borders after World War One. He sees this thing differently.
Hmm.
He essentially proposes that we have something like the Central or Eastern European Civil War, that World War One really didn't finish basically in Eastern Europe in 1918. And again, Poland is a good example, but then you've got the Polish-Lithuanian conflict, the Polish-Ukrainian conflict, the Polish-Bolshevik War. There is even a brief Polish, Czech conflict. And then, needless to say, you also have not just the Bela Kun dictatorship in Hungary, but you also have a brief, Hungarian-Czechoslovak war. So there is like everyone is basically trying to get as much as possible. Things cannot be fully sealed, at the tables, in Versailles or Trianon, and in other places where peace conferences are taking place in 1919. And in the case of the German territories, it's a mixed bag, because on one hand, the Poles are very keen to get as much as possible actually from the Paris Peace Conference. The exception, as you know, is the uprising taking place in Greater Poland around Poznań, that part of Poland, and then in the case of Silesia. But other than that, even in the case of these two uprisings, it is the international community which essentially intervenes. So you've got the peacekeeping units, stationed in Silesia after the first uprising, and you also have tensions, already materializing, within the Entente. So, for example, the Brits are thinking that, well, maybe the Poles really want too much, whereas the French are basically fine with this because they need a new buffer state between Russia and Germany, right?
Right,
They
sure.
need another, ally, especially if the traditional ally Russia is basically gone in this respect. So again, I think I'm convinced basically by Johann's thesis. He emphasizes basically the Polish case, and again, the turn to violence, but also he emphasizes the fact that these wars and skirmishes see, for example, the growing role of various paramilitaries, which are coming, from the echelons of local societies, particularly in ethnically mixed territories. That's why he basically comes with the idea of some sort of Eastern European, civil war, that it is very often at this point when people are deciding who they are, are we the
Right,
Poles,
right.
are we Lithuanians, are we the Ukrainians, this sort of things. Piłsudski famously basically said that, in the case of the East, the gate is wide open, and we basically have to just move in. But he also has, this sort of, federational, schemes, thinking that, well, maybe Poland can become some sort of regional, superpower, but in cooperation with the Belarusians, Ukrainians, perhaps even Lithuanians, but obviously, from the position of the hegemon, in this respect. Well, the end of the Polish Bolshevik War basically, kills the entire, Ukrainian question. So it's
Right.
and it's
Although, I mean, it seems almost tragic to look back and realize that Poland, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, received an enormous award. I mean, it was independent for the first time since the partition between the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Prussian empires in
yeah,
the late 18th century.
yeah,
And it was a great and united and consolidated country that could have focused on its own economic development and cultural development, and would have become a huge powerhouse, in a sense what's happening today in Poland, which is incredible. Poland is
mm,
becoming, it's amazing. I mean, it's becoming a
yeah,
huge, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communists, it is becoming a major power
history, yeah,
in its own
yeah,
right. And it's
yeah,
so, this whole focus on ethnic hegemony and control and a rewriting of borders was very mistaken on the part of the Polish governments and people. I mean, they might have focused Now, the whole issue, the sidebar of brutality that eventually manifested itself in Nazi Germany. Yeah, I think that we overlook the fact that this really started with the Bolsheviks. World War One, of course, was an atrocity, but the Bolsheviks were the first modern nation to really impose democide on their own people to a degree that had been unthinkable. I mean, we should note that Lenin, even before Stalin, was probably responsible for the liquidation of 3 to 4 million people. And this is before Hitler even, this is back when Hitler was probably a communist. I mean, he wasn't even out of the, he hadn't even joined the Nazi Party yet. And that the fact that, they had set up a gulag system that the eventual Nazi concentration camps was completely modeled on. And that the world basically shrugged its shoulders and even praised Russia. In the United States, you had leftist people like what was his name? The reporter Stefan come back, Lincoln Steffens. Oh, I've seen the future and it works, and all this kind of propaganda about how wonderful the Soviets were transforming human nature. I mean, they were literally creating this new type of man, this kind of new order, this very, atheistic utopian view. And I think that emboldened certainly the fascist movements in thinking that they could get a little bit more vigorous and brutal because the world would look the other way. And it especially emboldened the Nazis, who basically replicated much of the Bolshevik system and thought they would get the same pass because they viewed themselves also as progressives. And they were viewed as progressives up until the eve of World War II.
I'm not fully convinced. You always have to be careful, actually, with some with the role attributed basically to the Soviet Union in the development of the Nazi ideology and its criminality in a way, because this is a shaky ground. You may be aware of the so-called historical strike in the 1980s in West Germany, when God, I can't remember his name now. When one West German historian essentially was arguing that exactly Nazism was just basically, it was just basically, the response, to this meanness coming basically from the East. No, this is a very shaky.
Well, I don't mean to be simplistic. I mean, obviously, there's huge, other factors involved. I'm simply pointing out that on the level of the brutality and the authoritarianism and the centralization, that I think was the contribution of the Bolsheviks to the overall rotten picture of what Nazism became.
Well, and the Nazis were also looking at this, but the Nazis were also looking, at the Armenian genocide. Famously, right. Hitler at a certain point, I mean, he was paying attention to this, and he knew what was going on. Not exactly at that time, because he was Mr. Nobody, when Armenian genocide took place. But he was perfectly actually aware of what happened there, and I think he remarked that, well, nobody will remember about the Armenians. So it's this. There is also, there are also some roots in the case of the traditional view of East Central Europe as the German essentially sort of quasi-empire space, basically, Mittel Europa and all these things which the Germans were trying to implement during World War One, differently obviously than the Nazis, in during World War II. But there is also, a strong odium of anti-Slavic resentment.
For sure.
Got basically Hannah Arendt writing about, this sort of genocidal mentality which manifests itself in German West Africa. How the Herero people were, for example, treated, during the Kaiserreich. So there are numerous things. It is tempting, as I said, to see this sort of causality. Both regimes were definitely looking at each other, and both regimes were looking at their methods. And for example, Goebbels, reached the same conclusions, like Lenin and others, when it comes, to the role of propaganda, or when it comes to the role that can be played, by cinema, radio, and all these things. From this point of view, yes, they were profoundly actually modern in this respect. Whereas, whether the message was modern, well, it's debatable, if you, especially when you look at the Nazis, because on one hand you basically have this machinery, the military industrial complex, which you may actually call like this, but then on the other hand, you look basically what is going on in terms of the Nazi administration of the Russian lands and Belarusian lands during World War II, and this is some sort of quasi feudal, crazy no man's land, basically, where the Nazis are acting as some sort of medieval superhumans, basically entering the land of barbary. I mean,
Sure,
it's
the Lebensraum.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
okay, my guess is Mikołaj Kunicki. The book is Between the Brown and the Red: Nationalism, Catholicism, and Communism in the 20th Century Poland. The Politics of Boleslaw Piasecki. Now, Boleslaw Piasecki, as you say, started out on the right. I mean, involved in the fascist movement in the late 1930s.
Yeah,
Um, and just to go back to one big difference that I see between the Nazi National Socialist movement and the International Socialist Communist movement was that the Nazis emphasized race and biology and ethnicity as the part of the dialectic that would need to be overcome in order to create their demented idea of utopia, whereas the communists wanted to remove class. They wanted to remove,
yeah,
economic differences as a way
yeah,
to reach their utopia. So you have, the on the one hand, the by birth, a biological theory that I think emanated from Darwin, but that's another subject, that had been embraced by the Nazis. There's also the Catholic element that enters into the picture in terms of influencing anti-Semitism. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's, the church's fault, but the idea was that the Jews had to be in a subservient role. The Catholic idea of sicut Judaeus, and that certainly Protestant Christianity continued with that, and that they were an alien force within the country,
mhm.
that had to be subjugated and segregated and ultimately eliminated, um, and that this was predominant
The
in the.
church would not, just one thing, that I don't think that the church would go as far as basically talking about the elimination by
No,
Nazi means.
not
Yeah.
at all.
Eh,
But ultimately, it set the stage for legitimizing it, I would argue. Now I know that I don't think that they were consciously saying that, but this whole idea of the Jews as an alien force and as Christ
mhm,
killers, and
mhm.
damned to eternal hell, these things didn't help. Um, Going to Piasecki, so then what happened to him during World War II? Was he what was his politics and what was going on in his life?
Uh, Piasecki was the member of the resistance movement,
Okay.
and that is not surprising because the Polish fascists were they were as anti-Semitic as they were anti-German.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't matter if he didn't feel any sense of kinship basically with Hitler. There was a fascist leader, Piasecki, and his men, because these were mostly men. There were some few women. Would actually revere, and that would be definitely, at least for some of them, that would be Mussolini. But Piasecki, in the case of Piasecki, he is really coming, from the National Democratic Nationalist movement, and what differentiates him from people like Dmowski is his ardent Catholicism, um, and also this sort of, proto-totalitarian, tendencies, basically the issue of movement, the issue of charismatic leader, and the wish basically just to completely, to build, a completely new national radical Poland, Jew-free. Yes, absolutely. He wanted basically to he wanted to kick the Jews out, and in his schemes, they were supposed to leave Poland without any material compensation, and all this money basically and property which the new Polish national radical state would acquire would greatly enhance Poland's prosperity. This sort of things. I mean, there are some really interesting, but at the same time quite funny from our point of view, the articles which were written in which were published in 1938, at the time when Piasecki's movement was already disintegrating, and they are called the stories from future Poland, and it's really crazy what these people are talking about, because you've got such funny things like the Danish farmers coming to Poland, to seek advice, from Polish farmers, because Poland became, the country of honey and milk, and plenty. And all these materials, basically, all these articles, failed to mention one thing, that is how the national radicals basically acquired power, right? So this is like a political sci-fi in a way, and they didn't have any chances to acquire power. They were just thwarted completely by the mainstream nationalist movement, which was definitely as anti-Semitic as they were, but also by Sanacja. But when World War II comes, I mean, Piasecki is already, Piasecki already served in the Polish army in the 1930s. He's a junior officer, and he participates in the defense of Poland in 1939 against the Nazis. He is arrested by the Nazis in December, I believe, in December 1939, and things look like he's just going to be shot, essentially. And it is the intervention, basically, of the Italians that really saves him. Piasecki is freed in 1940, goes underground immediately because he knows that the Germans will be after him, and then gradually he joins basically one of the numerous underground organizations which are mushrooming at that point in Poland. Gradually has his own organization, which is called Confederation of the Nation. And this organization in 1943 is forced by the mainstream resistance group, that is the Home Army, to amalgamate its structures basically with the Home Army. So Piasecki becomes the officer of the Home Army, and he is active in the Vilnius region. So in the east, it's a really epic basically journey his tiny unit, does basically in terms of traversing, from Warsaw, from German-controlled Warsaw, to the parts basically of what is now Lithuania.
Lithuania, yep.
He's one of the few Polish resistance fighters basically who escaped the Soviet debacle, because the Soviets and the Poles liberated Vilnius in 1944, and then the Soviets immediately basically locked up the Poles. Piasecki escapes this, but he's arrested basically by the communist security apparatus in the fall of 1944 east of Warsaw. So his World War II card is not a bad one, I mean, he's patriotic credentials, but it doesn't make him less nationalistic. He still contemplates basically all the schemes he designed in the 1930s, and was definitely politically, he was still an extremist. There is no point basically of denying this. But again, at least he had to basically acknowledge, the command of the Home Army, which clearly was not basically, the hothead of various, anti-Semitic nationalist, gangsters basically.
But yet the Home Army, after the war, of course, lost its footing, and the Lublin government, which was a puppet of Moscow, was able to take over Poland. Poland, I mean, to be honest, I mean, it was completely sold out by Roosevelt at Yalta. I think we now know that from released documents.
Roosevelt didn't have to sell it because the Soviets were already there.
They were there, but there was debate over
Yeah, Yalta essentially sanctions, the situation on the ground. The Red Army is basically in Eastern Europe, and it's,
Yeah, but that it was still at a time when the war was still fluid, and there was an opportunity for the United States, which had enormous both political and moral power
yeah,
in Europe, to have helped liberate Poland,
yeah,
and the United States, thanks to not really so much Roosevelt, but some of the people around him who were manipulating the situation, like Alger Hiss and
hmm
others who were reporting to Moscow, were able to subvert the will of what most Americans thought was right and what would have been right, and allow the Russians to take control of Poland. And of course, that was a frittering away of what should have been a victory for the Western democracies um, at the end of World War II. But that's another subject. The point I want to
yeah.
get back to Piasecki after the war, and after the Soviet takeover of Poland. How was he able to adapt and become a part of that system, and to what degree did he compromise his own beliefs in Polish freedom and nationhood and Catholicism, etc., in the process of doing that?
He was always very skillful, actually, presenting himself as politically more significant than he was. That was the case before World War II. That was the case during World War II, and that was the case after World War II. As I said, he was arrested in 1944, in the fall of 1944. Then he is basically interrogated by General Ivan Sierov, who is, not someone you and I
Not a
would like
nice
to
guy.
meet.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, he's not a nice guy. He's essentially consolidating, communist power in Poland. But he makes actually a pretty good impression on Sierov because, again, he tells Sierov and Polish communists that in fact he is important when it comes to right-wing nationalist, right in Poland. That he's someone, these people who are still, in the forests or in hiding, they may trust him. So essentially, he's proposing the Polish communists and to some extent Sierov that he will somehow pacify these guys. What he also does is that he understands that a lot of people are being basically arrested at this point. Some of them basically are killed, shot and so on. There are definitely, quite decent motives actually when it comes to uh, some of his personal actions that are taking place, after World War II. He is helping actually a lot of people, mostly from the nationalist, right-wing milieu, but sometimes even others. But to make the thing short, I mean, he understands several things the communists understand too. First of all, Poland has become an ethnically homogeneous nation, which means that it's also predominantly Catholic. He presents himself now not as a fascist leader, but as a Catholic activist. And in fact, he has some contacts, with the Polish Catholic Church, and he's
Hmm.
viewed basically not as a stoolie, but someone, who, oh, okay, maybe he was experimenting with the wrong, ideological principles and all these things. But after all, he's a good Pole and he's a good Catholic. So, he's trying to act as some sort of a broker. Personally, his opinion is, and he was actually quite accurate, that the Soviets are here and they are going to stay. He predicted actually 50 years. Not bad, you know?
Hmm.
And in this respect, he believes that we are going to stay, we meaning basically he and his tiny political milieu, which he hopes is going to swell its ranks basically because there are many people thinking like him politically. So these people are going to, they will try to, how did he put it? They will try to overcome the victor, working for the communists. They will try to somehow corrupt the communist system by inducing, by inducing, for example, tolerance toward Catholicism, by inducing, the fact that it's not just going to be the communists, but perhaps, former, nationalist, militants that are going basically to endorse what is about to happen. Like many Poles at this point, he believed that there was some room for maneuver, basically, despite of the Soviet hegemony. And the communists basically decided to use him, because, well, they were thinking, well, there are going to be times when perhaps this guy is going to be useful. Therefore, they granted him with numerous concessions. The most important one was the establishment of the Catholic publishing house, which was really publishing actually a very good, decent, Catholic writers.
Well, let me stop and just ask you about that, because after World War II, the Catholic Church emerged as the world's most powerful and morally strong bulwark against communism. I mean, you had Catholic cardinals like Mindszenty in Hungary and Stepanak in Croatia being imprisoned, and they were at war with the communist movement, a war that eventually they won. When Pope John Paul II, a Polish Catholic Pope, brought together, celebrated Mass in Krakow, and brought together the world's largest single outpouring of people for a single event. Almost 1 million people showed up, and it was not too long after that the Polish communist movement was done, and that Havel emerged.
I remember the papal visit, in 1979, and it's clearly, the mobilizing effect, on solidarity is very clear. But you have to remember about one thing. The Polish communist regime that took power in 44-45 did not take extreme measures against the Roman Catholic Church in Poland.
Okay.
There's absolutely no comparison between what happened to Stepinac in Croatia, in Tito's Yugoslavia. Mindszenty, this is another story. Mindszenty was basically arrested in 1948, as far as I remember. So the Hungarian communists and the Yugoslav communists were definitely much more aggressive toward the Roman Catholic Church than the Polish communist government. And again, as I said, the Polish communists understood that now they have, ethnically homogeneous nation, which in majority, 90+%, is basically Roman Catholic.
Yes.
So they were not going basically to antagonize.
So they couldn't really mess with that, because I think we should know that
later, but they didn't have enough time, because Wyszynski was arrested, in 1953, already after Stalin's death, and he was essentially amnestied 3 years later. So the anti-clerical, the anti-church, offensive really never took off on such scale, like, in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, or Yugoslavia. I mean, there was always, this pragmatic element when it comes to Polish communist leaders, particularly Gomułka, who in 1945 is basically the leader of the Polish Workers' Party, the forerunner of the Polish United Workers' Party.
And Gomułka was the Soviet, I would argue, Soviet agent in Poland, and he also revived post-war anti-Semitism, even though, of course, the Polish Jews had been annihilated by the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And by the way, just as a sidebar on that, it should be noted that there was a fairly large percentage of the Jewish population that was pro-Bolshevik, and even though as Jews they had abandoned Judaism, they'd become communists, and they disavowed in most cases Judaism. Nevertheless, it was not a good precedent. It did not look good for the Jews.
It didn't look good. One thing we have to keep in mind is that when we are looking at the peak of the Jewish population in Poland, so we are talking about the 1930s, with about 3 million people. The members of the Jewish community who were communists were that much.
Oh, it's very tiny. I know that, but the fact that there were look, speaking as a Jew myself, I totally recognize that, but there were enough of them who embraced Bolshevism, and they were at high levels, and in some cases they were the most brutal members of the Bolshevik Party. that, and then you had a world Jewry kind of look the other way and say, even to this day, it's a terrible disgrace and it's a stain on the Jewish history, in the same way that Nazism is a stain on German history. That so many Jews did embrace this, and that we still, in a certain extent, either ignore it or outright defend it, because there are still so many communist Jews in the world, unfortunately. And it's something that's a complicated subject. It's for another day why that happened. But you're right to point out that the vast majority of Jews were not communists. Some of them might have been socialistic, but they were loyal to the Polish state. They were nationalist in many cases. A lot of them were on the right, like I am. And, they were not, they simply were not involved. But it was used in a way the Jews were scapegoated, because they could hold these people up and say, the Bolshevik movement was a Jewish movement, which it wasn't. And, it added to the pain and the horrors that the Jews had to face, unfortunately.
There's one interesting thing which you have to keep in mind about the post-war Polish communist leadership. They, as I mentioned, I already mentioned the pragmatic stance, attitude toward the Roman Catholic Church. But people like Gomułka were also pretty much determined not to repeat the mistakes of the pre-war Communist Party, which was viewed by the majority of population as, the Bolshevik saboteurs, composed mostly of ethnic minorities, all these things. But Gomułka, basically, one of Gomułka's priorities in 1945, and later when he became again, the Polish leader in 1956, was to present the Polish communists as good Polish patriots. And he knew that he had to essentially use the tool of nationalism. Hence, you've got basically, the presence of such people like Piasecki in the communist-dominated, political environment in Poland. It's definitely, I'm not the fan basically of Polish exceptionalism and things like this. But when it comes basically, to the communist rule and the ferocity of this takeover, of course, there is a civil war. Probably 90,000 people basically died on both sides between 1945 and 1950, let's say. But when it comes basically, to the level of pragmatism and the willingness to utilize, ethnocentric Polish nationalism, the Polish communists were very skillful, and that explains lots of things,
So they were basically able to do, in a sense, what Karl Marx himself talked about in the Communist Manifesto, which is to adapt themselves to local conditions, become chameleon-like. They had to play ball with the Catholic Church because Catholicism was so powerful. I mean, in a way, Mussolini, who was a Bolshevik in the beginning, adapted Italy to conditions, recognizing that the Catholic Church was a powerful force in that country, as were small landowners, farmers, and businessmen, that communism would not be able to take over right away. So they had to come up with what Mussolini called a third way. And I think that also describes the Polish movement of Piasecki, and probably, to a certain extent, the Polish movement of post-war communist Poland.
Yeah, in a way, you're right. I mean, again, just to not to stick the needle into this. Mussolini was not a Bolshevik, but he was a member of the Socialist Party, and indeed, he was very often considered to be, somewhat on the extreme of the Socialist Party, which explains a lot in terms of his leanings toward various forms of extremism. But again, you compare him to Hitler and to others, and he's not so bad in a way. But in the case of the Polish communists, I think there is also something else. I think Gomułka was genuinely sincere. He comes basically very quickly, the Polish communist leader. He comes very quickly with the Polish road to communism, and and this is not exactly the copying of the Soviet system. Okay, he says, for now rather than forever, but he says for now, we are not going basically to dislodge the Roman Catholic Church. We need basically their cooperation, or at least their neutrality. Secondly, we are not going to collectivize the Polish agriculture. No, we have to actually win the Polish peasants. How we are going to do it? We are going to divide latifundias, huge estates held by aristocracy
The
between
nobles.
basically, nobles between Polish, small and medium farmers. And then, yes, we are going to conduct basically the alliance with the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was really the first, casualty in this respect, because they were really swallowed. They were first, they were first neutralized by various, crypto communists operating within the ranks of the Polish Socialist Party. Those Polish Socialist Party activists who didn't want to cooperate would basically end up in jails. So it's this, but Gomułka was, I think, the more I think about him, and he's not someone from my story. This is not someone I like. This is not someone I sympathize.
Right.
It's very hard to sympathize with any of these people I wrote this book about. But I think he was sincere, actually, in calling for the Polish road, to socialism or communism, which would have to take into its DNA, national specificities, instead of copying, blindly the Soviet system. And for a while, he actually got, Stalin's approval until 1948, when he was purged from the Communist Party. But then he's back in 1956 after the years after the death of Stalin. So it's, he's, to many extent, he's sincere. And I think there are also some elements of sincerity when it comes to Piasecki. There is no doubt about this. So,
well, I mean, I think that they viewed the situation as, in a classic communist sense, as incremental, dialectical leaps forward, that sometimes you have to take, as I think it was Lenin said, one step forward, two steps back. I mean, you have to, work with the local conditions, and gradually, by use of the frog in the petri dish, ultimately implement world communism, which is the world becoming an ant colony. This doesn't happen overnight. It's not natural. And therefore you have to rewire society, and you have to rewire people and get rid of the enemies, the obstacles. And I would even say that Germany, I mean, Nazi Germany, it's the same deal. I mean, they played footsie with the Catholic Church, but they ultimately viewed the importance of removing religion from the scene in the final analysis, and creating this massive German Lebensraum that would dominate the world. I mean, it's these utopian movements. And yet, if you take a look, and this is maybe a more broad question here, the average Polish citizen, just like the average Jew or the average German even, and the average American, are not part of this. Most people want to have freedom. They want to have their property. They want to have control of their own lives and destinies to a large degree. The American system, I think, is a very good example of this, at least as it pertains to the United States. Every nation has a different version, but it most accurately reflects the natural condition by which human beings can prosper and develop happiness. And yet these authoritarian movements and their leaders, whether they be on the far left or on the far right, they do tend to dominate politics at different times, and they certainly dominated politics in the post-World War I period in Europe and throughout World War II. And afterwards, people began to reassert themselves, I think, in Western Europe. But my question to you is, why is that? Why can't freedom-oriented people develop a genuine movement that would take the high ground in politics and culture? Whatever. I know I'm tossing out a big one, but you're the Oxford professor, so I'm gonna ask you.
If you try to place yourself, in the shoes of people in 1945, in Poland, The legitimate government in exile is gone. The country, basically, which was invaded by Hitler and became, the first belligerent, basically, of the Allies in a way, and the country over which, Britain and France basically went to war, is declared to be on the winning side, but you know that that's not true. You lost your
Right.
independence. Um, and then the country is just basically smoking ruins, smoldering ruins. This is what it is. So the communists are essentially coming, and first of all, they are, saying that, well, we are going to be reasonable. We are not like them. We are not like the Soviets, or we are not like the pre-war communists. Who were some crazy fanatics and so on. We are good Poles too, but they also mobilize people for the reconstruction of a completely devastated country, and that
Yes.
message actually sold very, very, very well. When you have the reconstruction of Warsaw, rebuilding of Warsaw, it's a very catchy and patriotic, slogan. Secondly, it was pretty clear that there would be no, regardless, even before it was pretty much crystal clear that the Soviets would dominate this part of Europe. But already in 1941, 1942, when you have, the Polish government in exile and various, underground groups, and the communists are still very small, there was no doubt that there would be no return, basically, to Poland of the 1930s, that the country would drift left wing
Mhm.
uh, in terms of the management of the economy, welfare state, pensions, this sort of stuff. So there was already a potential, basically, for the change. You have to understand this, and then just as I said, I mean, you've got basically people who survived, 5, 6 harrowing, completely brutalizing, basically, years of the Nazi occupation, but also Soviet occupation, good parts of Poland, and it is some sort of semblance um, of normality. And if it's not normality, at least this is something you may have. Yes, you may have your job, you may have your family, and perhaps you will be left to your own devices for some time. It's pretty natural, basically, that you have,
Mhm.
and not to mention something else, which I completely forgot about, which is extremely important: social advancement. I mean, you've got all this, masses basically coming from the countryside, which were just beggars before World War II. You know, some of them were illiterate, and here comes basically the new system. And plead, if you plead your allegiance basically to this system, you are going to advance, either as the member of the Communist Party, or the member of the military, or the member of the police. And
Right.
by the 1915 or 16, when this sort of Stalinist period and the revolutionary fervor is gone, and you've got really existing socialism, it was still the case that for an ambitious peasant lad from Poland in the 1950s or 60s, what were the two best basically career options he could have if he wanted to leave, his forsaken village? Become a career military officer or become a priest, you know? So
Well,
it's
wait. I certainly understand that in post World War II, Poland would probably benefit by leaning left and leaning in the direction of a socialistic system, but not communist
not communist.
Bolshevik.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, why not a socialistic system like that which existed in England or in France?
yeah.
Where, yes, you would have a military, you would have the police, but you'd also have small entrepreneurialism. You would have the emergence of a middle class and of a free market,
Hmm.
and so I mean, to me, it doesn't really explain why Poland had to be so under the jackboot of a really a left, an outright leftist system. And I think that the proof that of the destructiveness of that, which I think really hurt an entire generation of Poles, is the fact that since 1990, Poland is now one of the most dynamic economies and cultural entities in all of Europe, and that it's also one of the most oriented toward freedom and the free market.
Yeah.
I mean, they're making up for lost time, but in a way, it's too bad that there were all those lost years where they had to live under the jackboot of this leftist oppression.
Yeah, I know, but you can't expect basically the entire country, to drop everything in 1945, grab weapons basically, and attack the Soviets.
No, but I think that the United States,
no,
as I said, and the Western allies deserve some blame for
they
not
do.
genuinely supporting the Poles in that, and that at that
Yeah.
particular time, with Russia really on its knees, it could have been done. That's history. We could talk about that at
Mhm.
another time. What finally happened with Boleslaw Piasecki in his career? I mean, did he change at all? What was he doing in his final decade?
Um, he was sort of yesterday's man in a way because um, what happens is that uh, in the 1950s and 60s, especially when Gomułka comes back to power, Piasecki really believes that he can somehow rebuild, the alliance the two had in 1945. So he was really hoping that his PAX, Catholic movement, would become a sort of, junior partner. Um, Maybe, entering some sort of, coalition government if the communists would allow this. However, what happens is that very early, by 1960, 1961, Gomułka essentially tells Piasecki that, you know, this is just something completely I'm not going to accept. You know, you may stay with your privileges, with your publishing house, with your small, parliamentary club in the communist-dominated parliament, but you are not going to acquire the rank of the political party. So it at this point he's very disappointed with Gomułka, and then he pins his hopes on this ultra-nationalist sort of quasi-fascist faction of partisans within the Polish Communist Party, which is becoming louder and louder in the 1960s. These people were extremely anti-Semitic. They were mostly the veterans of the communist underground from the World War II period.
Right.
Their leader was General Moczar. And when you have the anti-Semitic campaign in 1967, 1968, Piasecki is happily joining this campaign, because he thinks that now this is possibly the last chance for him to maybe he's hoping basically for the removal of Gomułka, and who knows, maybe Moczar is going to take power or not. It doesn't happen. Piasecki does not advance, and he spends basically the last decade of his life in the 1970s trying to interest Edward Gierek, the Polish communist leader, in his various, ideas about the Catholic political party, all these things. But Gierek is a completely different individual than Gomułka. He's not a millenarian fanatic. He's more like he's an opportunistic party apparatchik with some technocratic leanings, if I may say so. Or he would like to present himself as someone who was not crazy about communist ideology, but he would invest more into some sort of not even, how should I put this thing, still a communist system, but definitely more open basically toward the West. You have to remember about Western credits basically, that how he opened the Polish economy basically to this, which basically backfired obviously in 1980. So Piasecki spends his last decade in futile attempts basically trying to elevate himself to a bigger position. Years of very stressful life and heavy smoking took its toll. And when he died in January 1970, 1979, he was not even 64. So he was not a very old man, but, very, 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 very sick, basically. And, well, c'est la vie. I mean, this is like, the Crusader, basically. The Crusader entered I mean, when I wrote my PhD dissertation, because my book is based on my dissertation, the title was The Polish Crusader. That's how I describe, basically,
That's interesting. Yeah.
Piasecki. And so then, in the 1970s, he's basically operating in the environment which is not ideologically rigid as it was, basically. And he basically dies. His movement survives, basically, until the demise, basically, of the communist system in 1989. But like a whole plethora of small pro-communist organizations, which the communists basically brought to life in the 1940s and 1950s. But
Right.
interestingly, what I think happens is that some of his ideas definitely resonated, and I think some people in contemporary Polish politics sometimes speak the language of Piasecki or think in his ways without realizing this. The
Sure.
sort of fusion between nationalism and religion, ethnocentric identity, disregard toward different ethnic groups, anti-Semitism, and this sort of grandiose vision of Poland, as the country that can somehow connect, the bridge which can connect, the West and East. You can really find basically all these traits of thought,
Well, I was going
nowadays.
to ask you. I was going to ask you about that. In that, first of all, it seems to me to be really dislocating and tragic that that in his final years he continued with an anti-Semitic element, because after all, the Jews had all been annihilated by the Holocaust, and there were
Yeah,
very few Jews left
yeah,
in
yeah,
Poland after World War II.
yeah,
Either they had been murdered by the Nazis, or what the remnant had up and went to Israel or the United States.
yeah.
So, I mean, why? What is that all about? And is that still something that you find as a factor in Poland today? I mean, after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay, let me start with the first part of the question. He was anti-Semitic. He was an anti-Semite for his whole life. There is no doubt about this.
Right.
Uh, Even though in his movement there were people who were even worse than him, so he could even joke basically about these things. Then there is another issue, which is also important, which left a huge, how should I put it, scar, mental scar on Piasecki. In December 1956, his oldest son was kidnapped and murdered.
Uh,
He was a teenage boy, and his body was found only a year later, and it was pretty much clear that he was essentially murdered. Pretty much on the day he was kidnapped. Piasecki was really convinced that it was a Jewish revenge for, I don't know, his pre-war fascistic, anti-Semitic, this and that. Um, the crime has never been truly solved. The documents basically I saw suggest that Piasecki fell a victim to fractional struggles basically within the Polish security apparatus, which was in complete disarray during de-Stalinization. You've got some groups who were fighting each other. And probably, the choice basically to kidnap, the son of a well-known anti-Semite was probably there. Some people who were involved basically in this were in fact of Jewish origin, but as I said, it was definitely, the various, dirty behind the door struggles taking place within the Polish Communist Party and the Polish security police. But Piasecki was convinced that, his son was kidnapped basically and killed by the Jews, so that didn't help. But he really basically, he was also, what is I think more important is that he acquired this sort of image of the enemy which he projected by 1968. And this enemy was usually a liberal intellectual, more often than not of Jewish origins, and someone who Piasecki would describe as cosmopolitan, that is basically anti-Polish, anti-patriotic, and so on. And the people from his entourage definitely accepted this. So here is the answer, a long answer to the first part of your question. The second part of the question, whether these anti-Semitic things are still prevalent in Poland, they are definitely not as prevalent as they were either before the war or during the war or even under communism.
Right.
But there is, I think, too much tolerance on the part of the, and this is my personal view, but also the result of my professional observations, basically, of what has been going on for the past, 5 years. I think there is way too much tolerance on the part of the current government of Polish ethnocentric nationalism. I don't really like the fact that the president of the country basically visits the graves of the soldiers of the National Armed Forces, which was clearly basically a very anti-Semitic, quasi-fascistic, underground, but nevertheless, group, which on some occasions basically collaborated with the Germans. And these people really hated the Jews, and so there is something cardinally wrong, basically, when the right side of the spectrum gets basically the upper hand when it comes to projecting in a new way 20th century Polish history. That this is something.
It's very odd. It's very odd to me that nationalism, which in the Eastern European sense and in the European sense, is a lot more vigorous than the American sense. But nevertheless, I don't see as a bad impulse. But why it's so entangled with anti-Semitism when the Jews of Europe, their back was broken in 1940s, and they're not even there anymore. And to the degree that there are Jews in Poland, they're probably very nationalistic in terms of support of the Polish ideal. It's like a remnant of something.
I think it's not, because indeed, there are so few Jews basically left in Poland. We are talking about, I don't know, 8,000 maybe. It's not really this sort of active anti-Semitism which would see, pogroms or even, labeling people in public. You are a Jew, therefore, you cannot be a good Pole. It's not this. What I suspect, there is some sort of, retrospective anti-Semitism. And that has to do with the fact that as historical research has progressed since 1989, you can really see actually that, it is known now that more basically Poles than we thought before participated or helped basically the Germans when it came to the final solution.
Right.
And we know that some Poles were essentially killing, the Jews who went into hiding. So this is a sort of, retrospective affair. The current nationalistic government is trying to present basically the Poles as always righteous, always doing good things. Calamities and tragedies are always the result basically of external forces, not of Polish actions. This is the answer, I think, to your question.
No, thank you. I mean, it's a very complicated question because, there were some Poles who might have collaborated and did collaborate with the Nazis, especially in the Holocaust. But at the same time, on the flip side of that coin, Poland was occupied by the Nazis.
Yeah.
They were themselves under the oppression of this foreign army, whom they did not support, most Poles. And so it was a very complicated situation. Anyways, listen, Mikołaj Kunicki, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Would you like to give out any information to my viewers and listeners regarding your book or websites? I know that your book is available at Amazon.com. Again, it's Between the Brown and the Red. excellent book. I really am enjoying it. I recommend it. Nationalism, Catholicism, and Communism in the 20th Century Poland. And so, yeah, I mean, go ahead and mention any websites or anything you'd like to impart.
Well, as you put it, it's still available. Actually, a couple of years ago, the Ohio University Press actually also had the second edition. So it's out there. You can basically get it. And if you go into my website on academia.edu, which is basically an academic website when academics basically can put their publications, you can even find this book.
Yep, absolutely. That's where I found it. All
Yep.
right, Mikołaj, listen, again, thank you so much for an interesting talk. I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. Let's stay in touch. Maybe we'll do another program at some point.
Okay.
And have a great afternoon. Thank you, sir.
Same to you. Same to you.
Thank
Bye
you very
bye.
much. All right, and I'll send you a link to the program once it's up on YouTube.